Today's lecture, or clip lesson, is on Dred Scott versus Sandford. A really intriguing and fascinating Supreme Court case that proved to be the second major Supreme Court case to be argued based upon judicial review. It is that Supreme Court case which largely brought about and became the catalyst for the major cause which would springboard the Civil War. In order to understand this, my beloved scholars, we have to understand that the Civil War occurs from 1861 to 1865, and there are a number of significant reasons that bring this about. Dred Scott versus Sandford in 1857, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. Obviously, the Kansas-Nebraska Act does, popular sovereignty does, but obviously the big point is the constitutional decision, a constitutional congressional decision, I should say, of the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise came about in 1820, and basically what it did was it compromised Missouri and Maine. It made Maine a free state, Missouri a slave state, basically said all of the states that were north of Missouri would be free, and all the states south of Missouri would be slave states or slave territories. That is the base, if you will, which fuels the issues surrounding the Dred Scott case. But there's a lot more. You know, Dred Scott was a slave. Dr. John Emerson, and as you can infer from me calling him Dr. Emerson, was a U.S. Army surgeon, and he went on a tour of duty in the Army, which took him both in and out of free and slave states, with most of his years, or a number of years, I should say, spent in free states. And of course, he would take Dred Scott with him. Now, during this time period, of course, we get a lot of things that are going on, including the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically empowers the southern states to go up north when slaves would run away and essentially bring them back. And of course, we know this through the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. But okay, Dred Scott. Well, Dred Scott is Dr. Emerson's slave. And basically beginning as early as 1833, Dred Scott takes, Emerson takes Dred Scott with him on duty, on his tour of duty. And in 1843, Dr. Emerson dies, okay? And of course, the free and the slave states were determined by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So, Dred Scott, with the aid of abolitionist attorneys, basically begins his suit for freedom in the Missouri state courts in 1846. The efforts obviously prove unsuccessful, so he ends up going up to the U.S. Circuit Court in St. Louis in November of 1853. Of course, by 1853, popular sovereignty was really getting fueled. And he claimed that his residence in free United States territory, as well as in the free state of Illinois, essentially by default made Dred Scott a free man. The circuit court accepts the case, assumes jurisdiction for the case, and basically ends up ruling against Scott's claims. And then the case goes to the Supreme Court, which first delays hearings and then delayed deciding the case. And shortly after the inauguration of James Buchanan, which is the president right before Abraham Lincoln, they rendered their decision basically saying that he was not a U.S. citizen, and because he's not a U.S. citizen, he could not rule. All right, so there's a number of constitutional questions which permeate this case. First, what is the legal status of a slave? who is taken to a free state where slavery is against the law. Second, does a slave status then automatically change to that of a free person? Third, what is the legal status of a slave taken to federal territory where slavery is prohibited by congressional legislation? Does such congressional legislation constitute an unconstitutional deprivation of the slave owner's property by forbidding the slave owner from living in free territory with his or her slaves as property? These were the big central questions. And these central questions are brought up in constitutional law and Supreme Court decision-making, cases and essays, a book written by Sheldon Goldman. And it was published in 1982. So I'm drawing a lot on my information from that source, just so that you know. Well, obviously, this is before the 14th Amendment, so the whole idea is exactly what constitutes a citizen becomes very, very important. And all these issues really become pivotal. Now, what had happened, obviously, in this case was that Mrs. Emerson is actually willed Dred Scott. And Mrs. Emerson remarries in 1850 upon, obviously, Dr. Emerson passing in 1843. Now, Mrs. Emerson's second husband is an abolitionist. And an abolitionist is one who's against slavery. So, her new husband really doesn't want the responsibility. So at this point, this gets further complicated by the fact that Dred Scott's slavery status is transferred to Mrs. Emerson's brother. And Mrs. Emerson's brother is Sandford. Hence Dred Scott versus Sandford. And like I said, it's the second case that deals with judicial review. So I think that's also something that is very important. I have stated this before, but I just want to make sure you're clear. Judicial review is defined as a Supreme Court having the constitutional right to declare an act of the presidency or a law of Congress as being unconstitutional. And I think I said at the top of the taping that this is the second case to do so. The first case, of course, which established the precedent, was none other than Marbury v. Madison, which was a Supreme Court case which came to the High Court in 1803. In that famous case, you might recall, William Marbury had been appointed as a midnight justice the last evening that John Adams was president of the United States. When Thomas Jefferson became president the following day, you'll recall he was a member of the opposite party, the Democratic-Republican Party, or an anti-federalist. And this greatly angered John Adams. Well, the problem here, of course, was the election of 1800 was not decided through the traditional means of the Electoral College, because